Okay, we are going to jump into this whole area on the right side of the screen that I'm circling here called properties. We're going to go over most of these in briefly, and then at some point we'll be elaborating on several of them in detail. But for now, we're just going to explore some of the basics. All right, so to start with this, let's create a Suzanne head, a monkey, and just start with the first one here. And if you hover your mouse over the icon, this is the little camera, it shows the what the name of it. This is the render properties. Now, rendering is basically taking kind of like a creating a two-dimensional picture of your scene. And if you have different lights and shadows and camera placement, you create a kind of composition that you like. It's like making a photograph of your scene. So let's right click on this and smooth shade it a little bit, and so that we can start to see some of the actual effects of this, we're going to create another object. Let's create a plane and scale it up, scale it pretty big, and let's grab the Suzanne head and move it along the z-axis and just bring it above the plane. That's good for now. So the default rendering engine is called Eevee, and we're going to look at what that looks like and then talk a little bit about these two numbers. And later we'll go into great detail about some of the things we can do with this, but for now we're just going to give a kind of overview. So in your scene, if you hover your mouse over your scene, you can hit the Z key, and remember that we have wireframe mode from way back when, solid mode, material preview if we happen to have a material on this monkey, and what I want you to go into, which is rendered view. So your rendered view is a preview of what this will look like when you actually render it. It gives you the shadows, how your light's affecting the scene, etc. So let's do this. I'd like you to zoom out so that you can see your light, and grab your light and move it along the x-axis a bit, and move it along the y-axis, so that it's in front of the object, right? So you're actually it's real-time rendering, so you can, or real-time, rendering, I guess. So you can kind of see where your light's going to be. You can lower it if you want, lower it on the z-axis, so you can start to see how light and shadow work. Now, if you hit 0 on your keyboard, this gives you your camera view, what the camera's going to see. Okay, so with your object framed and your shadow showing, you can see that it's pretty good. It's a decent render. Now, the higher quality rendering, when you start to do photorealistic rendering, is going to be to use the one called cycles. And at first, you'll notice it looks really grainy, and as you move around, it takes some time to render. We'll work on this kind of noisiness and grain, but just so you understand now that this is the highest quality rendering, and when you get the settings right, you can create very, very high-end renders. The default is it takes a lot longer to render, and even in the viewport it takes longer to kind of catch up to you. A lot of this depends on your machine you're using. But if we go back to Eevee, now this is perfectly good for a lot of modeling and a lot of more graphic rendering, things that are used, don't need to look photorealistic, for instance. All right, so the sampling has to do with how much detail your screen shows. So it's telling you now that when you render it, it's going to sample 64 samples. This is higher quality than 16. It's showing you 16 in the viewport. So you can play with these right? If I bring up the viewport to match and I say, you know, you're not going to see a big difference. It's just going to take a little bit longer maybe. So for now, I would just leave these on the default. And just so you can see what rendering looks like, we're going to do this in much more detail later. If you go to the top left of the screen, you can choose render, render image, or the keyboard shortcut is F12. So I like to use F12. And it renders the scene from the camera's point of view. Okay, so we'll talk about, you know, how to move the camera in a moment. So let's do that. If I hit 0 on my number pad, I frame the image like the camera. If I hit N and open up this window, go to View, click on the Lock Camera to View. Now you'll get a red rectangle around your camera. Now when you move in the scene, you're actually moving the camera. You're recomposing the image. Very helpful. So just remember though to uncheck this when you're ready to get out of there. And now what you did is you locked your camera in that view, so wherever you are, if you hit 0, it goes back to the view you were in. Okay, so let's render it again, hitting F12. Okay, so this is a render using the Eevee render engine. Pretty basic. It does do light and shadow, not so complicated. If you go up to the render and change it to cycles, it's going to look a little bit better. And now you see that in the viewport it's only showing you 32 samples, but it's going to render 128. And let's hit F12 and watch how that works now. You're going to notice it's going to take quite a bit longer to do so. So this is a fairly large render, and you can see how much more it needs, how much more power it needs in order to do it. I'll just let this finish and twiddle my thumbs until it does. So with the Eevee render, it happened within a few seconds. And if you can look at the top of the screen here while it's rendering, it's telling you how much time this has taken over a minute just to render this one frame. Now, if you were doing an animation where you were trying to do even a couple seconds of animation, this would take, you know, almost an hour to render that animation, right? Because it's over a minute, maybe more than an hour actually. Minute per frame. Okay, so this is done. If you want to stop a render in the middle of it, which I do all the time, is you just hit escape and it will stop it. Okay, so that took almost 2 minutes to render that one scene. There's hardly anything going on, but that was with a lot of samples. If I drop this level of samples down a lot, it would be faster. Okay, so we're going to put it back to Eevee for now, and let's move on to the second property, which is output properties. And again, we'll get back to some of these later. Okay, did I switch? Yeah, switch it back to Eevee, and let's go to the output properties. So here's where it tells you if the size of your render. So this was the ones we've been doing are 1920 by 1080 pixels, which is the standard number for high HD. You can also, you know, change it either by changing the numbers here, or you can say, well, I want to just do a 50% of that render. So I'm gonna do, you know, and then hit F12, and you'll see it's you know, half the size, right? It's whatever half 1920 by 1080 is, right? So you can do that. That's there. We'll leave these things alone. There's really not much in this area that we want to deal with. Down here, it does tell you if you do render. If you were going to render an animation, for instance, here, this tells you the frame start and frame end. This is like, okay, I'm going to render 250 frames of an animation. And this is where I want them to be saved. And you tell it, okay, let's say I want to save it to the desktop. I would click this folder and I would tell it to save to the desktop. You can tell it what kind of file you want. JPEG, PNG is usually a good standard to use. And if you want it to be black and white or color, etc. Okay, we'll move on from there. This is just get familiar with this output properties. Okay, so the third is called the layer properties. Now, we're not going to do anything in here. Actually, we're going to skip over it. There's not much in this level of learning Blender that you'd need to do with this layer, so with this property, so we can skip it. The next is scene properties. There are some things you might want to do in the scene properties, mainly if you click on the background scene. Oh, I'm sorry, never mind that. What you could do, is you could change the units. This is a place where if you wanted to change it to the imperial system using inches and feet, you could do it here. Honestly, I think it's easier to leave it at metric, and a lot of the math is going to be easier figuring out distances and sizes and things like that. But if you wanted to change something here, you were doing something precise and it had to be in imperial, you would change it in this section. And we're not going to do anything else in there. The next is the world properties. Now this shows the world is the kind of surrounding scene or background in this whole viewport. So you kind of take it for granted, but this dark gray of the world, quote, world is controlled right here. So you could actually click it and you can make the world background color black, you can make it white, and all the shadows and everything else will update to affect it, to reflect what you've done. So the kind of global world color changes everything in the scene. So if I make it all a kind of blue color, well, the shadows are going to become blue too, because they're reflecting the quality of light in the background. So just so you know that. I'll put it back to basically where it was, and nothing else to do in there. So we're going pretty quickly through these. Again, some of them are more important than others for us. This is just a repeat. Object properties are the same thing as you find here under item in the main menu, so you really don't need to access this on a normal basis. There are probably some other things you'd want to do, but not so necessary for us. When we get into some physics and things like that, we will be messing around a little bit with this physics properties tab. Not now. Object constraint, this is for doing animation and dealing with armatures and joints and things like that. Again, nothing we're going to use at the moment. Oops, sorry, I had the wrong thing selected. Yeah, so we want to do a couple more here. So notice that these change depending on what you have selected. So if I have a light selected, for instance, they change. If I have a camera selected, they change. And if I have one of the objects, they change. So I want to have the Suzanne head selected so you can see what these are. Good. So in the next video, we are going to talk about this modifier, this wrench tool, and this modifier properties, and that is quite extensive. So we are going to go into that and look at some of the different ones and what they do. This is super useful. So we'll spend a whole video just looking at that, and then we'll talk about some of these other properties as well.